Okay, hello everyone. Today, I'm going to be making some of this stuff. And I say today, but it's like the 30th of September, and it's going to take a long time to get from these ingredients on the floor, in this tap, and lying around the house, to being this refined liquid in a bottle that is drinkable. So, I'm going to take you on the journey. I will tell you that you might not be able to follow along, because depending on where you live, the act of making a wash out of a waste product from refining sugar and then fermenting it and then extracting the alcohol by boiling it at 80 degrees Celsius for an extended period of time to make a distillate and then drinking that distillate might be illegal where you are. Luckily, I'm in New Zealand and it is legal for me to do that and consume it myself. So yay, land of the free, home of the behave, I suppose. So I'll take you on the journey of how I do it. There's no hypotheticals here, we can actually do the process, which is great, and I'll bring you along on the journey so you can watch and tell me if I messed anything up, if you are one of these people that does this as well. So I've made a couple of different rums. I've shown them off in previous videos. For the first time, I'm going to be using Buccaneer Bobs recipe, which if you've seen Jesse on Still It, you will have seen that recipe as well. I've got a few of these things I've had to improvise, so I'm just going to read through the ingredients and I'll lay over me doing the actions as we go through. So you are going to need 3 to 4 litres of molasses. I've got a 14 kg pail behind me. The difference there, the reason why it's a little bit vague is because it's 3 litres if it's running really thick and 4 litres if it runs like syrup. So I guess it depends on the quality of the molasses you're using.
That went super fast.
2.5 kilos of granulated sugar. I've got a bag of that. 2 litres of live dunder. Now, dunder is basically when you're finished distilling your alcohol out of your rum, what's left over is a non-alcoholic wash of molasses and whatever else you use to make that fermentation. So if you leave that in an open container, in a warm area, it will become infected by microbes and it will begin to bubble and be alive. I have a bucket of that from my previous rums, which is good to go in. It might sound really gross. It smells really gross, but you are heating it up and killing that microbe so that it doesn't actually infect the fermentation process, and then that just becomes nutrient for the yeast that you're going to put in to then eat up. And it also adds to the flavor as well. So as you go, the idea is that it becomes more mature over time and it takes on different qualities, kind of like a sourdough starter. We're going to need approximately 14 litres of fresh water so that it doesn't become too acidic. You need the juice of 2 to 3 lemons. Sorry to my wife who collected these, but they're going into the rum. And you need a 1 litre yeast trub. Now what that is when you've finished the fermentation process and you take everything out of your fermenter, you get left with a yeast cake at the bottom. It's done its part and it's probably died off. So it looks kind of like this. Now this isn't a yeast trub from a fermentation that I've done, because I didn't know I'd need those and I always just dump those out into the compost bin. So what I've done and what the recipe suggests is I've made a substitute with, it says 200 grams of yeast. I've only got a 150 gram container, so I've used all of that with some water and I've made up about 1 litre of yeast trub, which is also going to be cooked. So that's all going to get killed and again just add to the flavour and add nutrient to the yeast that we do put in for the fermentation to happen. And then it calls for 35 grams of fresh baker's yeast, but what I have is a specially formulated distiller's rum yeast, which is made to eat up those molasses sugars. So that's all good. And then the last thing it calls for in the recipe is 50 cubic centimeters or 40 grams of oak, apple wood, pecan wood, etc., or a block or dowel form. I have that, that's fine. So for stage 1 and stage 2, which we're going to do today, we're going to pour the molasses into a suitable clean 20 litre bucket and cover the bucket temporarily. We will come back to that. That's going to sit there for a while. In a large cooking pot, which I have behind me, we're going to pour our live dunder, 2 litres of that, the yeast trub, and 1 to 3 litres of water. I'm going to use 1 litre so it boils faster because I'm on a bit of a time limit here. I'm going to bring the pot to a boil, stirring occasionally to control the foam and to prevent the mix to stick to the bottom. Real basic stuff. I actually thought this part of the process would be really gross because we're basically cooking like old leftover wash that's been sitting in my garage for a couple of weeks, plus a whole bunch of yeast. But actually, it smells really good now that it's starting to heat up. So it's got this really
thick foam on it, but it smells like a really nice sweet bread or like a bakery because of the molasses and the yeast. I'm getting hungry now.
And then after the mixture has come to a boil, I'm going to pour that into the bucket as well and use it to dissolve the rest of the molasses and basically work that all up. I am then going to add the lemon juice to that bucket, and I'll add water, bringing it up almost all the way to 20 litres, and I'm going to let it sit for 2 hours. It says no more, no less, to give the sediment time to come to the bottom. Once it gets there, I'm going to siphon it out into another bucket. This is something I've never done before. If it was me, I'd just let it all ferment together, but this recipe specifically calls for it, so I'm going to do it like Buccaneer Bob tells me to. I'll use my racking cane to siphon off the clarified wash into a new, freshly cleaned bucket, and then we move into stage 2. Now stage 2 says that after ensuring that the mixture in the bucket has cooled down to 35 degrees Celsius, which I'm sure it would have because I'm only going to use 1 litre of boiling liquid plus the trub and the dunder, to remove about half a litre of the wash from the bucket and put it in a lidded jar or other reusable container and add the yeast to the jar. I honestly am just going to pour this yeast directly in and give it a good shake up because that's just how I do my yeast. Pour the yeast mixture into the bucket and stir again, introducing as much oxygen as possible to the wash. Again, I'm just going to stir it all up. And then cover the bucket well enough to keep the aromas and flavours inside and the bugs out, but loose enough to let out CO2. And store the bucket in a cool place. That's basically a really nice way of saying that you can basically use any kind of bucket to make a rum wash, which is a really good thing to know. If you think about the past of rum and making an authentic rum, they would have made them in buckets out in the open. We live in 2022, I'm just going to use a lid with an airlock. But if you don't have that and you are following along and it is legal for you to do so, yeah, do whatever. You can do whatever. And then we're going to leave it for about 2 to 3 days just to ferment out. Molasses ferments out really quickly. But that's not the only fermentable sugar. So here's where things get a little bit weird. I'm going to take a gravity reading at the beginning of stage 2 before I pitch the yeast, just to understand what the potential alcohol is. But stage 3 is where it throws me a little bit. So after about 2 to 3 days, I then need to carefully stir to knock out the CO2, so that's degassing, and then slowly add sugar, that's the 2.5 kgs of sugar we mentioned earlier, and stir well to dissolve it. So we're now upping the sugar content halfway through fermentation. So what I'm going to do at the beginning of stage 3 is take another gravity reading to understand how much alcohol is in there, and I'll take a gravity reading after stage 3 once I've added all of that sugar to understand again how much it's changed. I'm sure there's a calculator somewhere about secondary fermentation to understand how much extra alcohol you're adding by adding extra sugars. I don't know for sure. I'm an amateur in all of this, so we'll figure it out as we go.
So this whole process is a little bit weird because I was going to take a second gravity reading after I've added the sugar, but normally I add the sugar when the liquid is super hot and it dissolves so that you can get a proper gravity reading because the sugar is diluted with the wash. This is all sitting at the bottom in big clumps. I can feel the crystallization at the bottom and it's not dissolving, even though I've had this sitting on a heat pad all day to keep it nice and temperate, so it helps with that process. But I can just feel like tons of sugar at the bottom there, at least 2 centimeters thick at the moment, and I still need to add 2 more cups. So I don't know if it needs to dissolve for it to be eaten up. Usually I'd do an inverted sugar syrup. I can't do that this time because I'm following Buccaneer Bob's recipe, so I'm just gonna hope that Bob had it right and see how this turns out. This could just be a major waste of sugar.
This sits in a cool, dry place for another 7 to 10 days. I'm going to give it probably all up 2 weeks, but I will be taking gravity readings to understand for sure. Once that's all finished, we get to stage 4, which is our stripping run. So for that, what I'll do is I'll set up my still. I'm going to alter it a little bit so it acts as a pot still because I have a column still. So to do that, I'm just going to unattach the loop at the top that transports the water from the, I need to know all the technical terms here, from the downy bit where the alcohol comes out to the column where the vapors are rising. I'm going to unattach that loop, and I attached a new hose that would just drain off directly. So the only place it was receiving cooling water was the downward spout. And then I emptied out all of the copper saddles and packing that was in the column so that the
the vapor would have a clear path straight up the copper column and out. This is a more authentic way of doing it. When rum was made way back in the Caribbean, they only used pot stills, so you don't need a really fine and refined product from this first stripping run anyway, so I thought let's use the old process and do it that way. And it'll be fun to experiment around with the still a little bit. So 2 weeks after starting the fermentation process, it was time to do the spirit run. When I'm setting up the still for the spirit run, another thing that I do is I add some coconut oil to the wash. The reason why I'm doing this is when you get a molasses wash overheat, it is prone to foaming up, and that foam can go up through the column and end up in your distillate. And so adding the coconut oil will help break down any foam. It just breaks up the surface tension so that that foam won't make it all the way up the column. Once the spirits are collected, I then do a few other things. First of all, while the still is running, I get my fermenter and I just scrape out all of the yeast that's at the very bottom. This is the yeast trap. So at the beginning of the video I had to make this using bread yeast, and now I have for my next run of rum a yeast ready to go. So you have a perpetual system where you just keep collecting this, you store it in the fridge so that it doesn't ferment and explode, and you can use it on the next rum, and it just adds nutrient to that yeast and flavour. And once the still has cooled down the next morning, I collect about 250 mils of the actual wash that is left over. There's still a lot of unfermented sugars in here and molasses flavour. That's going to make our dark rum essence, so we'll come back to that once we've done the spirit run for this. I also take the opportunity to use some of this to top up my little dunder bucket so that I can keep using this going forward as well. Over time, the flavours that come through in this will only grow and mature like a sourdough starter, so it's very interesting what's happening in this bucket that's just sitting in my garage. Once I've finished topping up my dunder pit and taking some of the leftover wash to make an extract flavouring for the rum, I have at least 10 litres of molasses wash that's just unusable. So I want to find a use for it. I don't just want to dump this down a drain. All the alcohol has been taken out of it, all the sugars have been used up, but there are still some minerals in here that are really good for your garden. So I'm going to use the rest as a fertilizer to put on my chili plants and elsewhere in the garden as well. We managed to capture about 5 litres of 60% ABV as per the label, which is slightly higher than what the recipe told us because it said it would be 55%, but that's all good. I cut it out at around, it was dropping somewhere between 30 to 20% ABV when I decided to finally stop because I just wanted to go to bed. So we're now going to add this back into the still, water it down just a little bit so that it's not 60% ABV. I don't think it's 100% necessary personally, but it does say to distill things at 40% as sort of a maximum. And I think that's more to do with when you're using fire because you're less likely to blow up your house by getting alcoholic vapors going everywhere, which are highly flammable. But for the spirit run, we're going to do things a little bit differently. I'm only going to use one of the elements. The still that I'm using has 2 elements that are 1100 watts, and so effectively you can have both of them running at 2200 watts, I believe, to quickly bring the liquid inside to temperature so that it starts to evaporate. I'm only going to use one element today because I want to be very careful of where I make my cuts, and I haven't removed any of the methanol from this mixture yet either, so I'm going to be taking the first 100 mils and dumping that out, and then I can begin to take my cuts. What's really interesting when you're distilling anything is that at different points of the distillation process you will get different flavor profiles, and then it is up to you to mix those and blend those together to get the flavor of the end product that you want. We started with 5 litres at 60%, and at the end you will get all of that alcohol back out if you're patient enough, but not all of that is going to be the flavor that you want. So some of that you might end up putting aside and adding to what is called a faints bucket, which is basically just a bucket of alcohol that was unusable. Over time you can collect enough to redistill that and get another product out of it, but at this point in time we're just going to focus on the flavors that are good for what we want to make. So as you can see, I'm labeling everything and taking it in small increments. I'm still learning this process, so I'm not going to pretend to be a master at this, but I'm just making the cuts at intervals so I can come back and taste them later and decide what they taste like. So once you've collected all of your spirit and you have it in individual jars, you can start mixing this up. Now this is again something I'm not 100% used to. I have tasted some rums, I know what I like.
this might not be the same for everybody. So I just started mixing these together. Eventually I got to a point where I had 2.7 litres at 75%. And so I put this into a calculator. I decided that I wanted after dissolution a percentage of 53 ABV. And so this online calculator told me that what I'd need to do to get it to that point is add 1.12 litres of water, and that would produce 3.82 litres of alcohol with 53% ABV, which sounds perfectly fine for me. And once that was all done and dusted, I just added some toasted pieces of old wine barrel. This was used for red wine, and I added that into the jar, as well as an oak spiral that I've had for previous things as well, just because I don't know how effective these are going to be. And then I label it with the date that we had done this, which was back in October, and it's just going to be set aside with a few other things to macerate for a couple of months. I'd like to leave it as long as possible. I've never had the patience to do that, but we'll see how we go with this one. Just jumping back to the bit of the wash that I held aside, the 250 mils, I'm going to turn that into a rum essence, so we bring back some of the flavour and some of the colour from that molasses as well. How we do this is I'm just going to leave this aside to settle for a couple of days, and then I took one of my earlier cuts from the Spirit run and I've added that in, so it's a 50-50 mix. 250 mils of heads, which is at very high ABV, around 70%, and 250 mils of the little to no alcohol leftover wash. And then I'll just leave this to settle in the fridge for a couple of days. So what will happen is that alcohol will help drop down anything that's still floating around in solution, and that will settle at the bottom, and then I can extract what's left, and that becomes an essence or a flavor to add to the rum. The recommended approach is to add about 30 mils per litre, and that way you add some colour to the rum and that flavour as well. So we'll let this settle for 1 or 2 weeks and add it into the jar that's macerating, just to bring some colour back to it. And once it's added in, you can actually see it's turned into a very dark, very nice looking rum. So we're just going to let that sit for a couple more days, a couple more weeks, and just see how the flavour goes.
And now it's the 2nd of December, so the rum's been sitting on oak for about 6 weeks, I think. And I've actually, since then, used up that whole pail of molasses with a banana rum, and then another rum that is through its first distillation, so that's just the low wines. And I was setting up the still to run it through again, but it's a bit late in the night for that, so I might do that over the weekend instead. But I thought it was a perfect time to crack open that jar and give it a little try so I can wrap up the video, because as much as I'd like to just bottle it now and get it given out to people for Christmas, I think I'm going to leave it on oak for at least another maybe 3 or 4 months and just let it really mellow out, and then put it away in June. So here's the first try. It's got a really good dark amber colour, so quite similar to the rum you saw me drinking at the beginning of this video. And it's got a great aroma, so that extract that we made with the molasses wash that was left over after distillation has really come through. It's good. I can taste where it's going, but it's still very sharp on the palate. So straight away, it's very up in your face, and it has that very new make taste to it still. So definitely think it's a good call to let it mellow. Yeah, I think 6 months would be good. If I can push it a year, I will. It will depend on how much I can hold back on getting it bottled, because I get impatient with these sort of things. Definitely better straight off the bat than other rums that I've made without this recipe. So I've made maybe 3 or 4 washes before this, following other various recipes that didn't do the extract. And I think that this one definitely brings more flavour through. I think another big thing that's helped is removing the reflux from the still, so more flavour has come through rather than just the alcohol. So all in all, it's been a really fun experiment. I'd love to make, now that I can successfully make banana rum, I'd love to show you that process as well. And I'm also looking into making a French rum, or rum agricide, I think is what it's called, but I need to do a bit more research because I'm not sure if it is just sugarcane juice or watered down sugarcane juice. If it's the latter, it'll be affordable and I can do it. If it's the former, That's a lot of sugarcane juice it's a plant that doesn't grow natively here, so I don't think I can make a true French rum. But hey, I'm keen to experiment, keen to give it a try. We've got a whiskey sitting over here that's very special. I'll show you that video in a couple of months maybe. And yeah, that's all I'm going to say. Just time to sit back and enjoy the food in my labors, I suppose.